Hi there. I would like to start by asking a question. How do you know when you're going fast enough? When do you know that you're about to lose control? Eddie Rickenbacker.
Stanley here.
Pleased to meet you, Stanley. Eddie Rickenbacker.
Nice to
Eddie
meet you.
Rickenbacker. Eddie Rickenbacker. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Eddie Rickenbacker spelled R-I-C-K-E-N-B-A-C-K-E-R. Now that's not B-O-C-H-E-R like my father spelled his name, and I'll tell you why. Father and mother were Swiss immigrants, but then World War I came along. I wanted people to know that I am an American Rickenbacker, not a Heini Rickenbacker. And so I changed it. I remember Elgin well. I came here in 1912 through 1915 to drive in the Elgin National Road Race. And I want to tell you that Elgin was one of my favorite tracks. I raced all over the country, Daytona, Indianapolis, but Elgin was a lot of fun. I'll tell you why Elgin was a lot of fun. I had a favorite spot. We called it Aviator Hill. It was right down on Highland Avenue, and there was a hill there that we would approach 50, 60 miles an hour through the long straightaway. We'd get going 50, 60 miles an hour, and up over the crest of the hill we'd go. All four wheels would leave the ground, and boom, right down on the bottom, just in time to slam on the brakes before we got the hairpin turn. Turn around hairpin turn and down south towards Udina on the west leg. Oh yeah, that was a lot of fun. You know, in those days, I don't know if you know it, but we drove open cockpit cars. That means they kind of looked like that, but they really didn't have that door there that was the same way. And something else you might not know. We had two people in the race car, not one. You see, they had me, the driver, and they also had what we call a riding mechanic. Well, I imagine that if I call the man a riding mechanic, you can probably tell me what he did, right? What would you say he did? Oh, sure, of course, fix a car. Well, that was one of his jobs. But the job that he had that was much more important than that to me was this. As soon as we'd get going down the straightaway, we'd come to that turn, I'd start going around the turn and he'd grab me to keep me from falling out of the car. So he was doing a great job for me that I appreciated. Well, I told you I came here for 4 years, and then in 16 there were no more races in Elgin. They shut it down. The reason they shut it down, that there were big changes happening, big changes everywhere. I mean the war. It came along, and you might think that the natural thing for a race car driver to do when you go into the war was to fly airplanes. Wouldn't you think so? Of course. Why, the speed, the quick thinking, instant decision making, the skills, they're the same in the air as they are on the ground. But you see, I had a national reputation as a driver. And so, my reputation almost did me in. It seems that General Pershing himself had heard that I was there. And he said, I want Rickenbacker for my chauffeur. Oh, was I disappointed? Well, I knew there must be a way. There must be a way to overcome this. And I thought of it. You see, during the war, the roads in France where I was to drive General Pershing were pockmarked with shell holes and bomb craters. And so every time General Pershing needed to go somewhere, I'd get behind the wheel of that car and I'd drive it like I was going up to Aviator Hill and around the hairpin turn. Well, it didn't take long for General Pershing to get tired of that, and tired of me as well. So he got rid of me and ordered in a replacement. I had an opportunity now to go to flight school, but there was one small problem to overcome. You see, that was 1917. I was born in 1890. What that meant was that I was 2 years over the limit to get into aviator school. And so I had a doctor friend of mine who faked some papers and made me 3 years younger. Oh yeah, I got into aviator school all right. And a few months later, because that's all it took, I emerged from aviator school as a pilot for the 94th Aero Squadron. Oh yeah, now I was going to have some fun. Oh yes. In those days, we as pilots, we'd get up while it was still dark, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. We'd get out there and go down to the mess, have some coffee, have a little breakfast, and then we'd get out on the field where the planes were. Oh, can I still remember that experience? I'd go down on that field and we'd start those motors on those airplanes and they'd take off idling. They'd sit there and the smoke from the exhaust and the oil fumes and the fuel smell smelled so good to me. And then after a while, we were to take off at dawn. They'd give us the go-ahead. We'd push those planes out onto the runway, and we'd start to accelerate, and boom, 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 that rough runway, down the runway, boom, 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 boom. Oh, we were lifted off. It was so good, and I can remember how beautiful it was to be up there, going up through the sky, nothing but the fresh air from the French countryside blowing across my face. I could look out through the open cockpit that I was in, through the windshield in front of me, and right through that propeller that was spinning in front of my face, and I could see everything. On some mornings I could look out across the French countryside and see it covered with fog. And then there were days when it was a crystal clear day and I could watch the sunrise through the sparkling air. Oh, it was beautiful. But on those mornings I was on a mission. My mission was to cross over into the German lines. And we flew at relatively low altitudes many of the times that I was out. Sometimes as low as 500 down to 100 feet. We would be flying over, I'd be flying over the German trenches, and as I approached, I could look out the side and I could see these fellas down there with their rifles, standing outside the dugouts with their rifles pointed at me, pew, 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 and I could hear the bullets whizzing past my head. And they didn't know what I had in mind, but all of a sudden I'd make a quick turn and get down and get them in my sights, and boom, 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 100 bullets right into that crowd of guys, faster than they knew what was happening, and they would scatter and try to get back into the dugout, the ones that were still alive. Oh, I was having fun. Oh yeah. But you know what? Everything changes. And it wasn't too long before I was promoted. I was the commander of the 94th Aero Squadron. I had a few sleepless nights over that promotion. I thought about it. Why did they choose me? Why did I get this promotion? Oh, I'm a good aviator. I have a lot of victories. I guess I have leadership qualities. What can I do? What can I do to do a good job of being the commander of this 94th Aero Squadron? And I thought about it, and I thought about it, and I said, I know what I'll do. I will vow that I will never, never ever send my men out on a mission that I wouldn't go out on myself. And I lived to that. Most missions I flew with my men. I flew right beside them in the formation, and I showed them that I, their commander, wasn't afraid to face the same danger that I was sending them into. I told those men to hold their head up high, and when those bullets were whizzing past their faces, don't you believe that they have a chance of getting you? You are going to get them. Have confidence, men. And I was victorious, and we were victorious. Oh, yes. In fact, by the time the armistice was called, I was the ace of aces for the American side. I had 22 German aircraft downed and 4 balloons, a total of 26 victories, the best in the entire war. They gave me the Congressional Medal of Honor, and the French gave me the Croix de Guerre, whatever they call it, the Legion of Honor. I was honored by that, but there is one thing that sticks in my memory about that armistice. And I can recall that as crystal clear as any of my other memories. And that was, on that morning, I was 10,000 feet in the air. I knew that armistice was imminent. We knew it was coming, but we didn't know when. And so, as I was approaching the German trenches, instead of seeing the fellas down there with their rifles pointed at me, I couldn't believe it. I saw helmets being thrown up into the air, and they weren't down in the trenches, they were standing on top, and they were embracing each other and dancing, and then I went back over to the American side, and I saw them doing the same thing. And here is the most unbelievable part. After a while, and a few cautious steps from the German side and from the American side into no man's land, that we called it, they started to go slowly. They started to go slowly, and they approached each other, and they looked each other in the eyes, and they reached out, and they shook. They said "Wie geht's," and they shook hands, and they embraced each other. And here they were, just a few hours earlier, enemies, trying to kill each other. And now they were friends, never to fight again. That's what they promised. That's what we thought. Well, after the war, I had a reputation that was good to me. I was able to raise money to start my own car company, the Rickenbacker Automobile Company. Unfortunately, that mission didn't turn out as well as some of the others. We went bankrupt after a few years. But I had always told my men in battle, don't give up if a little setback comes your way. So the next day I borrowed $300,000 and I bought the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. The same place that I used to set records when I was 25 years old. When I was really 25 years old. Well, that prospered. We did well down at the Brickyard. And then, in another separate venture, I got together with some of my old flying buddies, and we put together a small airline called Florida Airways. By 1938, we had built it up to the most profitable and successful airline in the United States, Eastern Airlines. I became the president and chief executive officer of that company. Well, I want to go back now, and I would like to ask you the question that I asked you when I first met you. How do you know when you're going fast enough? How do you know that? I have an answer that I've accumulated. I've thought about it. My answer to that question is, you're going fast enough when you're going too fast. You're going fast enough when you're going down around that hairpin turn and you turn your wheel and the back wheels slide out from under your car and you have to struggle to get it back. That's when you're going fast enough. You're going fast enough when you're up in the air at 10,000 feet and there's 4 Fokkers behind you and they have their sights on you and you gotta go faster and you dive into a spin out of control and then you grab a hold and you bring it back and you zoom around and get behind them and you get them from behind. That's when you're going fast enough. You're going fast enough whenever you are not afraid to do those things that your competition is terrified of. That'll keep you ahead. That'll make you a winner. And I want to tell you that I started learning those lessons right here in your city of Elgin, way back, 1912 to 1915. I started learning those lessons when I was going down, up over Aviator Hill and around the hairpin turn. So Gee, I want to thank you folks for having such a fair city and a nice race course that you let me come and race on then. And even more, I want to thank you for letting me come back today. Thanks a lot.
Well, I'm so glad you all could come. My name is Edna Geister, and this is my sister Janet. Is there anybody here who remembers that lumber company that used to be at the corner of Kimball and State Street right on the river? That was the Geisters Brothers Lumber Company, and it belonged to our brothers.
You know, actually, our father had built a house there in 1868 when he first came to Elgin. And the reason he chose that area is because the Fox River reminded him of the Elbe River in Germany, where he had grown up and spent so many wonderful years. He had some wonderful plans for that area, for his home and his farm, until he found the Milwaukee Road also had some plans. And they built their railroad tracks right along the river.
Yes, you know, Papa was very disappointed when the railroad took part of his land. He loved his homestead, but you know, he didn't stop working. He kept working harder and harder, and he developed that homestead into a beautiful and productive place. He made it a family gathering place, a place where we all could come together and have fun. You know, he built a huge house for that time and day. It eventually had 19 rooms. They needed every single one of them because there were 10 of us Geister children, and there was Mama and Papa, and usually there was an extra child who was needy, who was staying with us.
As a matter of fact, Edna even wrote a book about it called The 11th Child, about a little girl who came to live with us for a while as Mama nursed her back to health. You know, our family had some very strong values about church and home. And Father, they also felt that they needed to give back to the community. Papa would give his workers turkeys at Thanksgiving time before it was the fashion to do so. He also loved his new country very much, and he encouraged other people from Germany to come and join him. He bought a large tract of land at the northwest side of Elgin, and he sold the lots off at reasonable means to other German immigrants. He sometimes even paid for their transportation over into the new country.
Yes, with 10 of us children, there was always something going on. Why, it became a gathering place for all the kids in the neighborhood. What one of us didn't think of, the other one would. And the kids would just flock to our house because there was always something going on in Geisterville, and they didn't want to miss it. You know, we lived so close to the Fox River that it was one of our main sources of amusement. In the summer, there was boating, and in the winter, there was ice skating. I've got to tell you a story about Janet and the boat race. The boat race with Long John Meyer.
That's a good one.
Long John Meyer, he had this boat. It was long and narrow, and he could just make it fly through the water. Oh, Janet was no slouch herself.
That's right.
So some people in the town thought, well, you know, let's have a boat race between Long John Meyer and Janet and see who would win. So they decided that the race would be from the bridge to the tip of the island and back again.
And that was very far.
No, was it? Wasn't either, because they gave
A little.
you know, half, you know, they let Janet start halfway, and so off they took. Well, when they got to the tip of the island, Janet still had a decent head start. I mean, she was still ahead of him. Turned, went back down toward the boat, toward the bridge, and Long John closed the gap faster and faster until finally it was neck and neck. Why, no one knew who was going to win that race. They were so close. Well, in the very end, Janet crossed that line with 2.5 inches before he did. Now, I'm here to tell you that some people thought the race was fixed. Well, Janet never admitted to it, ever. But the crowd liked it because a girl won.
part of the reason I think we were all so strong is that Mama and Papa felt that we should all do our chores and have our chores to do before we play. Each one of us had chores that we had to do every day. And as we grew older, the younger sibling would take our chores and we would take on the older sibling's chores. But, as Edna said, we had fun. Papa had a playground that was built for us by our homestead, and it had swings and a slide. And remember that merry-go-round? There was a hub in the middle, and the arms came out, and there was a floor that was built on it, except for a little area right at the center, where a child could actually get in there and push, and with relatively little effort, get that merry-go-round moving in a whir. Not a few children fell off of that thing. But it also helped Janet one time. It helped Edna one time. Now, we, of course, went to church every Sunday. And actually, we also went to Sunday afternoon Sunday school. But at the later afternoon, the children, we were playing dominoes on the porch. Well, we had a neighbor, a saloon keeper, a rather rough character, but he was reformed at this time. And he wanted to make sure the rest of us were reformed too. He came up to our porch and he saw us playing, and he took his cane and knocked over our dominoes and said that nobody should be playing any kind of game on a Sunday. Well, Janet, unlike her, sassed him something awful. He turned towards her and started going after her with his cane, but she jumped in the middle of this merry-go-round and started it going around. And to make matters worse, she sassed him and said, "You come and get me if you can." Well, he was a rather portly gentleman, and as I said, he had a cane, so he wasn't much he could do but yell. Mama came out, and as you also know, this was not proper behavior for a Geister child. So Edna got extra chores to do for several weeks, but the rest of us helped her out with those extra chores, because the other part of the story is that Mama told the man he was no longer welcome at the Geister house.
You know, I got my start in the field of recreation right across the river at Washington School. I graduated from North Central College in 1913. And when I came back home to start to work, they assigned me to the 5th grade class. What? They wouldn't mind me no matter what I did. It was horrible. It was just horrible. I just didn't even want to go to work every day. Well, one day I heard this terrible ruckus out on the playground, and I heard this ruckus, and I rushed down to find out what in the world was going on. Well, a bunch of boys had been playing ball, and they were arguing over whether you could run to first base after a third strike. Well, anybody who grew up in the Geister household would know that. So I settled the argument, got everybody organized, and then I saw the bat. Now, I hadn't batted the ball for a long time. And I asked the boys, I said, "Can I bat once?" And they said yes. And do you know that luck was with me? I hit a home run. Well, after that, my life was so much easier. It became easy to direct the playground activities. I became so good at it that Miss Huff, who was the principal, asked me to take over playground activities for the whole school. My whole life was involved with recreation and fun. You know, during World War I was the director of recreation for the War Council for the YMCA. And at the same time, I was the national director for recreation for the YWCA. With my work with the War Council, I traveled to Europe, Hawaii, Alaska, and I set up recreation programs for our boys in the armed forces to boost their morale. After the war, I went back to school and I got my master's degree from Columbia University. But you know, I had all of these ideas and memories and thoughts and ideas just swarming and swirling in my brain. So I started to write books. I wrote Icebreakers and Geister Games and The 11th Child, 13 in all of them. You know, I have even heard that people people as far away as Japan have read my books and enjoyed them. I traveled, I lectured, and I had fun. I never believed that life should be a grim endurance race. I was certain that fun and recreation promoted democracy. And I was certainly sure, because I had learned it, that it helps you love your neighbor.
You know, I fear Edna, I was a little more staid than Edna was. But at this time, there were really two professions that were open to women: teaching and nursing. And I chose nursing. I graduated from Sherman Hospital School of Nursing in 1910. And while I did some nursing, I also found that I liked to find out more about the causes of situations and why things happen. So I went back to school at the University of Chicago and took a course of study in social work and social research. Well, I learned a lot there, but I also made some lifelong friendships with some astounding people like Jane Addams and Julia Lathrop. Julia, in fact, asked me if I would go and help her do some research on infant and maternal mortality, a serious problem at that time. And I went out in groups, in partnerships to Montana. She goes to Hawaii. I go to Montana. And there were no Holiday Inns or McDonald's at this time. We had to carry our food out for the whole week and cook it over sagebrush fires in the evening. Oftentimes we slept in the cars and by the side of the road. We would go from homestead to homestead and interview the women and find out the details of the things that had happened in their life. I gathered a large amount of research, but I also gathered a lifelong admiration for these women that could build a home in sometimes very high states of deprivation and very far from their closest neighbor. The next thing that Julia had me do was go to New Orleans to work with the World Health Care there. And I worked with an engineer, and we devised one of the first mobile health vans. It was actually a big stainless steel trailer on the end of a truck. And as we went out in the countryside there, people again would flock to us to get the health care that they so desperately needed. Now, during this time, too, our profession was starting to undergo some criticism for how much money we made. And our education to become nurses. And I found that power actually came from organization. So I became involved in the American Nursing Association, and I was executive secretary there. But I was also very honored to be elected president in 1927. Now, Edna wrote books, and I also wrote too a lot, but I wrote articles for nursing journals and hospital magazines. In fact, I wrote over 300 of them from 1918 until my death. In 1948 was another high point for me, though, when I won the Golden Award of Hospital Articles for another article that I had written about how nursing had changed during this time. You know, Edward, our brother, wrote in his reminiscences that no one had more plums, more hard work, or more fun than the Geisters. And I feel that that's a fitting epitaph for our family. Thank you very much.
Rebecca Gilbert. Rebecca McBride Burritt Gilbert. The original Rebecca McBride was my mother, who lived at 129 East Division Street, and my father saw to it that I was named after her. She was very proud of the fact that I was a graduate of the Elgin Academy, and she tolerated me as I tried to discover myself through several careers. For a time I was a local teacher, for a time I was a postal clerk. I also took every opportunity to jump on a train straight down to Chicago because I love the big city life. Now on December 29th, 1884, standing in my mother's living room, my life was changed forever. See, that was the day that I married Peter Burritt. There was a little scandal because of our wedding. See, I was 33 and he was 68. And some people thought that I was marrying him for his money. But of course, that wasn't the case. The same people said that he was marrying me for my youth. Well, any of our closest family members and friends knew that we were just a wonderful match together. And so we were wed at my mother's home. Following the ceremony, we went with two of our closest friends, James Lane, who was from here in town, and his wife. They went with us to the city, and then we left for New Orleans together, the four of us, and vacationed and honeymooned down in sunny Florida. Now, when we returned the following spring, I was a changed woman. Well, I had become accustomed to having a wonderful, upscale life, and I enjoyed all the finer things. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Peter. See, Peter was a very eccentric man. He was born and raised in Hanover Township, just east of town, and was a farmer for a time. But Peter had a brilliant mind and really knew how to take his dollars and turn them into more. See, he invested heavily into some downtown land in Elgin just in time when the property values were rising, and that was in the late 1880s. Why, for a time, Peter had 90 parcels of land, and he sold them off just when the time was right. In fact, he sold one of his parcels off to the First Congregational Church. We enjoyed a wonderful 7 years of marriage, living in Elgin during the summer months and vacationing down in Florida during the winters, until after 7 years, Peter became very ill, and he was bedridden, and I stayed right by his side. The following year, he passed away. And I'm sure, as you can imagine, when the will was read and I was the full inheritor, there was much talk again, much gossip of people saying, well, she finally got what she was in it for, which of course was not the case. And the newspapers failed to report that my husband was very generous in leaving his 3 sisters not only $5,000 in cash each, but each one of them also received a home on North Street, as well as their children. Peter, my first husband's nephews, each also received a home. See, Peter had 7 homes on North Street, and he gave each one of them off to his family members and to 2 of his closest friends. I thought that was very generous. After a year and a half of being a widow, I fell in love with William J. Gilbert. Now, there goes the gossip again. See, William J. and I were friends for many years. We were closer in age and both grew up here in town. And so when we were wed, there was another scandal involved, saying that he was my true love all along and I was just trying to get my inheritance so that we could have a happy life together. That was not the case. We had crossed paths many times, but the time was right at that moment for us to be married, and so we were, and had a similar wedding to my first one, only this time it was at the Great Northern Hotel in Chicago. Now, the couple I told you I went on my first honeymoon with, the Lanes, they were our witnesses at our wedding, and they also accompanied us on our honeymoon, William J. and I. We again went down to New Orleans and had a wonderful stay in Florida, as William J. and I were married in January, and it was again winter. Now, there was some talk about me spending a significant amount of time on my honeymoon in the Bahamas, but I figured it was my honeymoon, it was nobody else's right to know exactly where I was. And by the time I came back to Elgin that spring, we had already broken ground on our dream home. Our dream home was located at 330 Division Street. And the following spring, in April, I gave birth to a little girl, and like my mother, I named her Rebecca. I had it all. I had it all. I traveled during the winter months. I had a beautiful home in Elgin, a man who loved me, and a baby girl. It was wonderful until 2 days later when tragedy struck and I found my baby girl dead at 2 o'clock in the morning, less than 2 days old. So there are some things that money cannot buy. After several years, I felt it important to leave a memorial to Peter in some way because he had shown us such a wonderful life, William J. and I. See, William J. was a very hard-working man, and he worked for the newspaper here in town as a newspaper delivery person and sold newspapers for a long time and worked very hard. So after we were married, he was able to retire, and we enjoyed a fine life together. So in 1908, in honor of Peter's first wife, I had a building erected in downtown Elgin. And on top of the pediment, I had the name Henrietta put in there, as his first wife was Henrietta. She never had the opportunity to enjoy the finer things in life that I did. For 30 years, that building was occupied by the Swan department store. They had a wonderful run, and after they closed their doors, then Sears Roebuck and Company came in and was there for quite some time. Now today, that building is occupied by Elgin Community College in downtown Elgin. 5 years after I had the Henrietta building put up, I had a building built for my husband in his honor. It was a large parcel of land right on South Grove Avenue. Again, the small talk started in town. Some of them said that the reason I had this building erected was because in order for me to get the rest of my inheritance money, I had to put up a building in his name. Other people said that because I was so in love with William J. that the guilt was killing me and I had to have a building put up in his name, my first husband's name, just so that I could go on. Of course, neither one of those accounts were true. It just seemed like a wonderful memorial to do for my husband. And on South Grove, it was a great place to have office space leased out. Now, that building was known as the first skyscraper in town. Why, it was 5 stories tall. And the first story was used just primarily for office space. We leased that out with no trouble. But because there wasn't enough demand in Elgin at the time, we never finished the rest of those floors. And in fact, I had an elevator bank put in there thinking that at one time I would put the elevator in and then finish off the rest of the stories, but it never took place. See, I leased out the elevator bank to New Mode Hosiery, and they provided a wonderful source of income to myself and William for many years, and so we never finished the building. Now, when I was in my 60s, and again once a widow, I felt that I really wanted to have that building finished. I wanted to have that complete. And so I hired an architect to go in there and take a look at it, and I found out at that time that it was a bad idea, a bad business decision to put in the expense for something that would never give us the return. And so in my day, that building was never finished. Now, I passed away in Miami, Florida. My body was returned here to my hometown, and so I rest with my first husband, Peter, his wife Henrietta, my second husband William J., and our baby girl Rebecca. So was I at one time the wealthiest woman in Elgin with over $600,000 in inheritance? Maybe. Was I the victim of much scandal, claims that were never true? Without question. The answer is right here. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Well, who would have thought that a young man from Elgin would have had experiences to fill a lifetime in just 22 short years? My name is George Roy Coleman, and I was born on December 13th, 1922. Elgin provided me with your basic all-American childhood. I went to McKinley School, was a member of the Boy Scouts, and then went on to Elgin High. And while I was at Elgin High, I played right guard on the football team. I was a member in 1939 of the heavyweight squad when we were given our nickname, the Tying Tornadoes. And we had a never say die approach. Although our record was only 1 win, 2 losses, and 3 ties, we proved a formidable opponent for any opposing squad. My senior year, I was also the co-captain of the squad, and my football playing earned me a scholarship to Iowa State University. It became apparent, though, that the world climate was not going to allow me to stay in school. And so, in November of 1942, I enlisted in the Army Tank Corps. The training that I underwent in the next year and a half took me all over the country. You can see by the map all of the different bases that they had us train at, all over the country. In fact, no sooner would we get to one than it seemed that they were telling us to pack up and sending us to another one. The training was grueling both emotionally and physically. Because of the gas rationing, we often had to run around the battlefield on foot during maneuvers, as there wasn't always enough gas to run our tanks. During this time, I was selected as a candidate for the OCS, or the Officers Training School, which I attended for the next 90 days. And the men had a saying this time that we'd never go overseas. And with all the practice and all of the dry runs, we were all starting to believe it. But the escalation of the war in Europe made everyone think otherwise. I arrived in England on March the 2nd, 1944, as the second lieutenant of the D Company of the 741st Tank Battalion. The next 2 months we spent training in England, and it became apparent that our first combat experience would be at the Allied invasion of France, known as D-Day. And D-Day was a unique invasion, in that at Omaha Beach, the tanks went in ahead of the infantry. Our tanks were loaded onto carriers and fitted with special devices to allow them to float to shore after they disembarked. When the time came for us to take Omaha Beach, some of the tanks rolled right off of the carriers and sank directly to the bottom of the sea. And those of us that made it to the beach were greeted with a hailstorm of enemy fire. The following is a description of my battalion's actions on that day from a presidential citation that we were awarded. Armored units of the battalion led the assault wave in landing in the face of extensive and elaborate enemy minefields, which had not been cleared or gapped, and under the withering artillery, anti-tank, machine gun, and mortar fire from organized and fortified enemy positions. In spite of extremely heavy losses, the attack was aggressively pushed against the unexpectedly still enemy resistance, thereby enabling the infantry to hold the beach. When planned exits from the beach were unusable due to enemy installations of roadblocks, minefields, and fortifications, the 741st Tank Battalion forced new exits from the beach against the enemy positions, and by such action enabled the beach line to be secured and held, ensuring success of the landing and the beachhead. Only through the courageous performance of the officers and enlisted men was the objective secured. In the midst of unceasing enemy fire and often in the face of certain death, duties were performed unhesitatingly and with utter disregard for personal safety. The courage and devotion to duty shown by members of the 741st Tank Battalion are worthy of emulation and reflect the highest traditions of the Army of the United States. After the battle, I was promoted to first lieutenant, and this put 3 tanks and about 30 men under my command. We pushed further into France. The fighting was heavy and the casualties were high. On July 26th, I was wounded from shrapnel when my tank was hit at Bagnères, and this sent me back to England to recuperate. The wounds that I received gave me the option of going home, but I decided to stay, as the job that I'd come to do in Europe was not finished. And so on August 18th, I was let out of the hospital, and in September I returned to the 741st, now as a member of the B Company, for the battle on the Siegfried Line. We spent the next 3 months trying to punch through into Germany, and the taking and retaking of the same German pillboxes wore on both sides. On December 11th, 1944, 2 days before my 22nd birthday, we went into Belgium. The ground was snow-covered, and it was clear that we would not be spending Christmas at home. On December 16th, the Germans launched a massive offensive against us. And this was a surprise because for the last 6 months we'd had them on the run. But this beginning of the Battle of the Bulge served to show the true character of the Allied soldier. Outmanned and outgunned, we fought hard and slowed and eventually stopped the German offensive in its tracks. On the 3rd day of the battle, my tank was destroyed as my men and I were trying to hold a crossroads. My life was one of thousands lost in the European campaign. And in closing, I would like to say how proud I was of all the fellows that served, and how proud I was that I was able to do my part for my country. Thank you.
May I proudly introduce to you Dr. Carlton Starrett.
Next patient, please. Might that be you, madam? Aches, pains, ailments? How about you, sir? Problems urinating? Obnoxious gases? I understand your reluctance to seek medical care because, after all, once you've come to the cemetery, it's a little too late. to get proper type of care. Besides, we're not properly acquainted, and I believe that the better half of the doctor-patient relationship is not in the pills, potions, and ointments we administer, but in the personal relationships we have with the patients. So let me tell you just a wee bit about myself. Dr. Carlton Starrett. I was a practitioner here in Elgin from 1886 until my early and untimely death in 1908 at the age of 43. And they asked me to probably bring to you some experiences that might be relevant to your everyday events, and I had this Morning Tribune delivered to my site here. And I see a lot of talk of war in the paper. Let me briefly tell you about my little experiences with war. That was the Spanish-American War, 1898, which was really more of a skirmish than a war. As you might recall, the United States had spread from coast to coast, and our aspirations spread overseas, and we looked for some opportunities to expand our sphere of influence. And so we sent our battleship, the Maine, down to Havana Harbor in February of 1898, and after it lay there moored for about a month, it exploded and sunk. Although we don't really know what the cause of that explosion was, the war cry was rampant throughout the land, flag waving and so on. And I was a member of the Illinois National Guard, and our regiment was organized and activated to service in April of that year. We spent a couple of months in training and being outfitted down in Springfield and then on to Georgia. Finally, we were put on boats and sent off to the Caribbean. But we arrived there in early August with our heavy uniforms in the sweltering heat, and they landed us in Puerto Rico. Not exactly Cuba, but they thought the Puerto Ricans needed to be liberated. And so we were put ashore there, and within a few days the war was over. The Spaniards had left. They had no interest in hanging on to Puerto Rico or Cuba, and they were gone. But our leaders in Washington thought it was best that we try to bring the Enlightenment to the American way to these people, and so we put ashore and put into an encampment. There was 106 officers and men in my company, and within about 2 or 3 weeks, 2/3 of them had been taken ill with typhoid, malaria, dysentery. Most of them were struggling to survive, and the rations that they sent us weren't of much help. We had canned beef, which sat in your stomach like a lump of lead and then ran through you like galloping horses. We had stewed tomatoes, most of which were sour. We had hardtack, which was more suitable for roofing material. And the greatest outrage of all, we had an inferior and weak grade of coffee. And so I wrote letters back to my wife, and I wrote letters back to the congressman. And after 3 miserable months in Puerto Rico, during which time we never fired a shot nor saw a Spaniard, and mostly just sat to intimidate the local natives into believing that they had been saved, we came back to Elgin. I appeared before congressional committees to testify about the folly of sending American troops ill-prepared overseas. Well, I settled down to a nice little practice here in Elgin, delivered a lot of babies, fixed a lot of broken bones, lanced a few boils, and had a nice little home up there on the corner of Center and Jefferson Street, right next to the old St. Joseph Hospital. But then in the spring of 1908, I took ill with meningitis, and I tossed and turned in fever for several weeks, and finally I succumbed. And just like when they sent us off to the Spanish-American War, where we were put onto trains with a lot of hoopla and flag waving and parades and military bands, and we ended up in that godforsaken place of Puerto Rico, they came to my house for the wake, and they brought out the military bands and the drum corps. The mayor and all the city councilmen were honorary pallbearers. All the fire apparatuses were dragged out. The majors from all of the National Guard infantry units in Illinois came to the place. And there was a great funeral procession that led from my home on Jefferson and Center down to the Congregational Church. Very nice service there. And then finally all the way out to Bluff City Cemetery here, where I was laid to rest under a 21-gun salute. So let me remind you that when they have a big flag-waving parade to send you off, the results may not be exactly what you had in mind or preferred to be. So now, is there anyone here that needs to see the doctor? No? Well, perhaps the next time you come around, I'll tell you about growing up in Chicago for the Great Chicago Fire. That was really quite a weekend. What a catastrophe that was. But I think time has run out and they want me to lead you along. If anyone needs to see me, come by my office, 23 Spring Street. I'll be there, at least in spirit, later today. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
My name is Charles Gould. As you can see from my dates, I was born in 1828 and died in 1917. During those 89 years, 70 of them would be spent in Elgin. I'd have great success and some failure in life. I immigrated from Massachusetts when I was 14 years old with my family. We located on a small farm in Hanover, which is about 5 miles southeast of here. After the war, the creamery business was just getting started. At that point, I had already been married, you can see, once. My wife, Sarah, we were married in 1857. We had a child in 1858, and she died 3 days later. Sarah would never recover, and she would die 6 months later. My next wife, Marietta, we were a little bit more successful, I guess you could say. We ended up having 9 children. And 5 would outlive me. Of course, Marietta, you can see by the date, she died well before me. And 7 years later, I'd marry Carrie Collins. Now, she's not here. I don't know if she was threatened by the other two, but she's also in Bluff City in a different section. And she was sort of different to this area. She was not from this area. She was more liberated, as much as you could be in the 1880s. She went to Germany for 2 years and studied piano. She came back to Elgin to study also. And 2 years after moving to Elgin, we married. She would outlive me by 10 years. And she'd be my companion back when I would go back to the family farm in Hanover. That farm, I realized, was producing too much milk. Shipping it to Chicago or getting a market for it was difficult. It's a tough product. You've got to put it in the tins. You've got to send it. It's kind of a tempestuous product. It goes bad. I decided to create a creamery. So in 1867, I started creating more creamery butter and cheeses at the farm. That led to success. I was creating a product that was beyond anything else being produced at the time. I eventually would control 7 other creameries, and I would have a hand in 5 others. In 1872, my fellow creamery members decided to establish the Board of Trade. We wanted control. We wanted to control the product, we wanted the control of the quantity, and we wanted the control of the quality. In our first year, we traded about 30,000 pounds of butter and about 90,000 pounds of cheese. 10 years later, we traded over 2 million pounds of butter and over 9 million pounds of cheese. We were a success. Other areas looked to us. We set the price, we set the quality, we decided what was produced and what was not produced. I also was a different kind of thinker. I no longer was a farmer, I more was a businessman at this point. With the several creameries, I kept a hand in it, but I just oversaw the work being done. I came up with the idea, I never capitalized on it like some others, but I came up with the idea of cutting flour barrels in half and transporting the butter that way. You could cut them to different sizes, 20, 40, 60 pound barrels, and they would ship easily, and it was a perfect product. The barrels were remarkable. No nails were used, they were just put together and they held. They were a perfect transfer. They were waterproof, they were a perfect transporting material. Also, we saw more boxes being built. The Elgin Butter Tub Company was producing over 90,000 barrels and just as many boxes for cheese. I didn't have a hand in that. I came up with the idea, but others created the factory. Elgin Butter Tub eventually became Elgin Corrugated Box, which is still around. During my time, I made Elgin popular, not for watches, but for butter. We controlled the market. People would look to us. We no longer had to go to the people. The people were coming to us. St. Louis people, Louisiana people, people in Europe knew of Elgin Creamery Butter. In 1885, after all my success, the creameries failed. It was due to, we had a long, hard winter. I overextended on credit, and there's a new scourge out called margarine. I retreated back to the Gould family farm, proud of the fact that I made Elgin world-renowned for the product that it was producing. I created, or I helped create, or I gave a market to the paddles, the vats, all the other mechanical means were producing Elgin. It was an industry among itself. I would die in 1917 after an illness, 89 years old, and I felt I had done well in the world. But there was one scourge, and I touched upon it earlier, which was margarine. Now, I don't want to make any bold statements or go out on a limb, but I want to say that margarine is the devil in stick form. Milk is a wonderful living product. It's given by the cows. They're glad to give it to you. They live for that. You make products, it's a healthy product. Margarine, where does it come from? Dead cows. The stockyards in Chicago were rising. They had this product, they were rendering this margarine. They were making it look and taste like butter. But we all know it's not butter. I feel that if I leave you with nothing else today, I want you to come away with a new appreciation for the pinnacle that Elgin was during the 1890s and the 1880s and 1890s for quality products. And I want you to also remember that margarine is evil. Thank you very much.
I wasn't born in Elgin. I wasn't raised in Elgin. I didn't live in Elgin. On a dark and windswept night, April 19th, 1872, I got off a train, asked the night watchman where the hotel was. He directed me to the Waverly House on the corner of State and Highland. As I was making my way there and back of the hotel, in the dark of the night, someone put a bullet in my head. Not everyone in this cemetery died in their sleep. More than 400 have been killed in automobile accidents. More than 125, like me, have been murdered. I was the first. I came to Elgin at the urging of my uncle, Person C. Gilbert. I carried with me $3,000 to buy a farm out here in the West. I came from upstate New York. After the murder, the state of Illinois offered a $200 reward for the capture of my killer. The city of Elgin offered a $600 reward. Now you might say that's not much, but $600 was a whole year's salary for a typical worker at the watch factory. The mayor of Elgin personally hired a Chicago detective to find out who my assailant was. Of course, I would like to tell you who it was, but it was so dark I couldn't tell. All I know is that some people back in Ithaca, New York, knew that I was carrying money out here to buy the farm. And I was killed for my money. They found my body with my pockets turned out. I was lying between the tracks of the Northwestern. No one has ever been apprehended for my murder. The city marshal in Elgin made 2 trips to Ithaca to try to identify some of the people who might have known I was carrying $3,000. My assailant never got the money. I sewed it, the bank drafts, and the back of my underwear shirt. Well, ours is a violent society. Between 1991 and 1999, 10 years, 57 people were murdered here in Elgin. 40 of them males, 17 of them females. 40 of them died by gun, 12 were stabbed, and the rest were strangled or beaten to death. Ours is a violent society and in many ways a violent city. And in most of those murders, the assailant and the victim were acquainted. And so I would like to remind you, when you leave, to watch out for your brother-in-law. And also, don't roam around the streets of Elgin at 2 o'clock in the morning. Remember me and thank you.
I'm Wilda Logan. I was born in Elgin in 1897 and lived here for all of my 87 years. I graduated from Elgin High School in 1915 and received bachelor's and master's degrees in physical education from Northwestern University. I taught physical education and health at Elgin High School for 45 years and an additional 5 years at Elgin Community College. I was around young people all of my life. I think I enjoyed being around them because they were willing to take chances and try new ideas. And I think I chose teaching because I liked being a part of that process of trying new ideas and learning things. The colors of the class of 1915 were orange and navy, and our motto was, "Watch us." We put on the comedy night to raise money. We participated in athletics and social events, and class spirit was lively and strong. Sometimes that class spirit got out of hand, like in 1911, when the juniors stole the senior class flag. The seniors tried to get it back and a fight broke out. Some of the men teachers tried to break up the fight, and even so, clothing got torn and the flag got shredded. The seniors retaliated by shredding the junior class flag. And then the seniors and the juniors planned a confrontation at High School Park, which I think you now call Gifford Park, until the police got wind of it. During my student years at Elgin High School, I saw displays of outrageous behavior, by others of course, never by me. Boys shoved girls in the hallway. The girls walked 5 across in the hallway, blocking traffic, an annoyance when there were 800 people trying to move about every day. The boys knocked books out of our hands. They talked in class. They were boisterous. Please tell me this couldn't possibly go on anymore in high school, could it? I began teaching physical education at Elgin High School in 1917. I saw the beginning of events that became traditions that are still going on today. In 1922, Elgin High had its first homecoming. They had a float parade, a football game, and a dance. In the 1923-24 school year, the Student Council was formed. They came up with the idea of the one-way stairs to relieve the overcrowding, and they developed rules for behavior, and they formulated a dress code. In 1924, the alma mater was first sung. How we love the Elgin High School. And later on, I started a tradition of my own in the PE classes. I taught the senior girls how to play bridge. And many times you could hear the sound of shuffling cards throughout the lunch breaks. I understand that some of the girls from the class of 1960 still play bridge today. In 1935, high school life took a serious turn as Congress debated the Wagner Act, which sought to give union rights to workers throughout the United States. The school board had decided to demote T. Arthur Larson from being vice principal of Elgin High School to being that of a teacher and a department head. The school board, the students thought that this was an insult to TA after 27 years of service to the school. The school board gave no reason for their decision, and when they heard about the growing student unrest, they said there was no point in reconsidering. The students thought otherwise, and they set about gathering signatures on the petitions which they presented to the school board. The school board decided to reconsider after all, and they met with a 7-student group who presented them with a petition that had